Welcome to the Praxis Report. I'm your co-host for the podcast, William Barth.
I'm your
And
co-host, Jonathan Brown.
welcome again to another podcast of the Praxis Report, the report that tries to combine political theory to the various serious political challenges that we face, and also tries to produce a practical solution that progressives and political activists and others, scholars, can apply given the challenges we face. Again, we're a little unique. We don't just look at news events like a murder, a burglary, and a fire, and then talk about it. Instead, we try to take a methodological approach or use political theory to analyze the problems we face, and then talk about practical solutions we can implement to help solve those problems. So that's what makes the Praxis Report unique. And we have an interesting show today. We're going to hear from our co-host, Jonathan Brown, who's going to talk a little bit about the question of China. And China is very important to people who care about the future, about progressive politics, about uh, building an anti-war progressive political association or response or political party, because everybody seems to be at war with China. Democrats consider China an enemy and talk about China in warlike terms. And Republicans and neocons discuss China as sort of an enemy of the American people and talk about it in warlike terms. Now, it wasn't always that way. Historically, China was a friend of Americans. Chinese and Americans were friends. And we're talking about like an eighth of the Earth's population, a country with almost 1.5 billion people, which Democrats and Republicans and most mainstream politicians want to be at war with. So we thought this podcast is a great opportunity to talk about that and its relevance to building an anti-war coalition, given we're at war with China, according to most political pundits and prognosticators. So we have Jonathan Brown, who is somewhat schooled and expert in this matter, especially the politics of China, the history of China, the colonial background that produced the Chinese Communist Revolution and other events. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John Brown to talk a little bit about Chinese politics and history, and then we'll get back to this broader question about what we're going to do about all of this. So,
So,
John, you want to take it from here?
yeah,
Talk.
excellent introduction. So, the question of the day is China and in the United States and in the Western world, the media demonizes China, as do, as you said, Democrats, Republicans, all the politicians. They portray China as this authoritarian dictatorship that is a threat to the world. And the assumption I want to put to the audience is if we recognize that our government lies to us about Vietnam and lied to us about the war in Iraq and lied to us about all sorts of things, why do we believe that our government is telling us the truth about the People's Republic of China? So, what I'd like to do is just kind of dig into the history of how China came to be the country that it is today. And to really start that, we have to look at China as a what they call the century of humiliation. And this was in the 1800s. China was under the boot of the British Empire. And Britain really forced China into submission, flooded the country with opium to get the poor peasant population addicted and weak. And they basically just looted and plundered China's economy and completely destroyed the sovereignty of the country. So China entered the 20th century as a non-industrialized country. China was still a agrarian, feudal, peasant society that was mostly illiterate and rural. And they were facing foreign domination, not only from Britain, but also the Japanese. And so this question of communism in China, the Communist Party under the leadership of Mao, was not only fighting against foreign domination of the foreign occupiers and imperialists, but also the internal feudal warlords who had carved up China and oppressed the peasantry. So when the Chinese Revolution happened in the late 1940s, they had to succeed not only in defeating the internal warlords and landlords that controlled the peasantry, but they also kicked out the foreign occupiers. And their challenge was, how do we take this country that is feudal, that is peasant, illiterate, agrarian, and how do we turn this into a modern, advanced, industrialized power? And that's the path that China had to go on through the 20th century. Is there anything you'd want to
Yeah,
add?
I want to highlight, John, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party revolution
Yeah,
and what difficult revolution it was. You know, we talk about revolutions and we think about revolutions. These are events that happen all over the world, not just in China. It happened all throughout Africa, all throughout Asia, all throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, colonial countries under colonial subjugation. And we have to remember that colonialism is not a democratic system.
not at all.
Colonialism was a system that was akin to slavery.
That's
That's
right.
what colonialism was. And that these states throughout the world had to fight what they call the yoke of colonial domination. They call it the colonial yoke. That's what the scholars and the UN scholars call it, and free themselves, from this condition of near slave-like conditions for the country that was colonized. China had a particularly difficult job doing that, and their revolution, I think, lasted 10, 20 years before they finally succeeded at establishing an independent China. And there's wonderful sort of literature about that struggle to free China from its colonial yoke. And it's one great book is Red Star over China, which is the story of the Great Retreat led by Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, where they literally marched on foot from one end of China to the other end of China on foot to preserve the revolution and to make the revolution a success and to live to fight another day. So it's an incredible story when you look at it, and even more incredible when you think even after China won its independence and won its freedom, the Western world wouldn't recognize it. Even today, you have leaders like Nancy Pelosi, Democratic leaders, Republican leaders who say, we don't recognize the government of China. We recognize Taiwan. What the hell? What is Taiwan? Taiwan has always been a part of China. Even Richard Nixon, the ultimate Cold Warrior, admitted that Taiwan is fundamentally a part of China. And yet today we talk about Taiwan as if it's a separate country, as if the Chinese government does not control China. And it's really quite disrespectful. You might even say racist, to borrow a liberal analysis,
That's right.
to refuse to recognize the Chinese peoples and their government as the legitimate authority for the country of China. But anyway, I don't mean to get off
Really,
base. Why don't you
not
continue a
at
little
all.
bit?
That's an excellent point. And just as a kind of, you touched on Taiwan, we're going to bring that up as well. Just to add to that, Taiwan, the people that lost the Chinese Revolution in 1949 fled to Taiwan, the Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalist forces.
The Guomandang?
Yes,
Yes.
and they sort of deny the sovereignty of China. They claim that they are China, that they are the legitimate rulers of China. So there's a contention that China claims that they have to resolve peacefully within themselves under their own terms, which is the peaceful unification and reintegration of China and Taiwan, which have been, as you said, part of one country, one civilization for centuries. And even Richard Nixon, the United States has always recognized the one China policy. But today, we're sort of seeing the militarization of Taiwan, where America has flooded Taiwan with weapons and has arming sort of like separatist groups who want to go to war against mainland China.
Right.
Um,
It'd be like, foreign powers not recognizing that Hawaii is a part of the United States. I mean, it's
that's right.
ridiculous.
And then flooding Hawaii with weapons to
Yeah,
try to.
with weapons and to support Native Hawaiians and their
Yeah,
struggle for liberation to establish Native Hawaiian as the official language of Hawaii, which I support, by the way. But
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
another subject.
But
Yeah.
it's a question of this who has the right to have sovereignty over their own decisions in their country, and and that kind of brings us to the next step in China's history, which is after the revolution. China faced this challenge, of rebuilding after World War II. It was occupied by Japan and was brutally, occupied. The Japanese were quite brutal to the Chinese,
A
and
brutal occupation, and to this day, it's common in Chinese culture to have hostility towards the Japanese because of how the Japanese occupation went and how Japan treated the indigenous Chinese peasantry and peoples.
That's right. And on top of that, like I said, the biggest thing people in the West don't understand is that China's challenge in building socialism was to advance and develop its economy, to go from a feudal agrarian peasant society to an advanced industrial society. Now, in the West, we did that over several centuries. And how did we do it? The Industrial Revolution started in Britain, and Britain did that by going to the Americas and colonizing and extracting resources and using slave labor from Africa to extract resources from the colonies. So Britain spent, or we could say the West, Europeans spent centuries industrializing and advancing their economies through slavery and colonialism. China did not have that luxury. China did not industrialize its economy through enslaving people or through colonizing other nations. China used socialism and collective planning to sort of collectivize their agriculture and develop industry and reform the land so that feudal peasant or feudal warlords were not owning the land, but it was collectivized by the state. And so that was a challenge of developing the economy, getting rid of feudal backwardness. But unlike the West, China did not rely on slavery, genocide, and colonialism. And so that was a remarkable challenge because China has risen to industrial power in less than a century without using colonialism and slavery, whereas the West spent centuries enslaving Africans and colonizing the entire world in order to industrialize. And I think that alone is something we in the West don't quite understand, is that challenge China faces to modernize and industrialize without subjugating and oppressing other nations in the process.
And achieve such incredible heights, creating today what the world's one of the world's lead economies, and also technologically, showing the kinds of advances, magnetic trains that float, and bridges and buildings, and all sorts of engineering and architectural wonders being established by the Chinese Communist Party that runs China. It's really quite remarkable. Harkens back to the sort of things we did here in the United States during the New Deal, post Depression, post World War II New Deal, when we built the Hoover Dam and highway systems and incredible buildings and bridges. Of course, we don't do that any longer, but
We don't.
China does it.
Well, and something else I want to share. I did a little research and found some statistics. And people in the West might find it hard to believe that the Chinese Communist Party is actually very popular with the Chinese people.
Yeah,
And
John, if you could talk a little bit about that. You often talk about do people have believe in the credibility of their government? Like we Americans have no confidence in our governmental structures and our institutions. What about the Chinese peoples? How do they relate to their structures, to their institutions, their governmental institutions?
okay, that's a great question. The term that they use, they use a term that is actually kind of sounds contradictory. They use the term the People's Democratic Dictatorship, and they also sometimes call this whole process people's democracy. And they say that the type of democracy they have in China is different than what we have in the West. Whereas in the West, we have, these two parties, Democrats and Republicans, we vote. every 4 years. But in reality, both parties are controlled by capitalists, by wealth, by billionaires. Both of them are capitalist pro-war parties. So in China, they would say we have this illusion of voting and democracy, but in reality, the two parties are part of the same system. Whereas in China, the Communist Party is the dominant party. And democracy and elections and voting has to go through the framework of recognizing the legitimacy of the Communist Party as the ruler of the country, as the sovereign. But within that framework, there is full democracy in the sense not just that you go out and elect people locally and nationally, but democracy in the sense that the government of China is responsive to the needs of the people and actually providing for their interests rather than for the interest of the elites. And so, one example of that, if you can see the screen here, this is a graph showing life expectancy in China from the year 1850 to 2020. And we can see that in the 1800s, life expectancy hovered around 30 years. You were expected as a poor peasant that you would die by your 30s for the most part. And this was, again, we talked about the century of humiliation when Britain, the British Empire, controlled China and plundered it. And it wasn't until we see here around the end of the 1940s when the Communist Revolution took place and communism came to China that we can see the life expectancy has gone up continually every year since the communists have came to power. So that it went from being in the 30, you would live till your 30s, to today, you have the life expectancy that rivals the United States, that you're living until almost 80 years old. So one reason that people in China support the Chinese Communist Party is because they went in less than a century from dying before they were 30 years old to living a full natural life.
Incredible achievement. Just incredible.
Another one more thing to show.
This is important. The
Data.
elimination of extreme poverty in China, which we in the United States are currently facing an extreme poverty epidemic with what they call our homeless population. I think they have a new term for the homeless now. I think they call it people without homes or something.
Yes,
The
or the
liberals
unhoused.
have given it a sort
The,
of
the
politically correct.
unhoused.
The
Something like
unhoused,
that. Yeah. But
unhoused.
in China they this is interesting because this is not data that comes from,
The
Chinese.
Communist Party. No, this
Yeah. This is
right,
from the World Bank. And
right.
if you guys watching this know, the World Bank is the leading capitalist institution in the world. It is a bank that represents the Western capitalist countries. So this is not something coming from China. This is Western capitalist countries admitting that China, since 1980, has virtually eliminated extreme poverty, has lifted almost 1 billion people out of extreme poverty over the last 45 years. And the World Bank actually says that this is the biggest poverty reduction program in human history to lift 1 billion human beings out of poverty. So even our capitalist banking class admits that China has expanded life expectancy, reduced and eliminated extreme poverty, and there's several other statistics like expanding healthcare, eliminating illiteracy because most peasants in China were illiterate before the Communist Party and there was a huge push. So now the whole country is literate. So if you just look at why do people support the Communist Party of China, it's because they've seen in the last century their standard of living has risen. Their quality of life has gone up. Their life expectancy, their poverty level has gone down. So they're receiving tangible material benefits. Whereas in the West, in the United States, every decade we're seeing our life expectancy decline. More poverty, more homelessness, younger generations unable to find jobs, unable to afford to purchase their own home. So we're going in a direction where our generation is seeing worse and worse conditions than our parents. Whereas in China, they're seeing their life expectancy and their quality of life, their standard of living rising. And that's a key difference that I think people in the United States do not understand because our media and politicians don't want them to understand that.
Right. And at the same time, not only tending to these social questions like eliminating extreme poverty, and it was the brutal poverty in China amongst the peasantry. There was generational stories that we used to hear about the poor Chinese children, living off a bowl of rice a day if they're lucky, and maybe
Yeah.
a piece of pork in it at the end of the week. That was their big, that was the big thing they had to look forward to. I mean, just
Brutal.
unbelievable poverty, rural poverty. And to achieve that, but at the same time, to make all of these economic achievements in the economic competitiveness of industry with electrified vehicles and these
High-speed rail.
infrastructure modern wonders that China keeps producing. In other words, they're doing both together. They're eliminating the social the plague of these horrible social conditions on the one hand, and don't forget when they first started the Communist Party organizing back in the day, the country was rife with the famed Chinese opium dens
Right.
and poverty and every kind of brutal exploitation you can imagine. To overcome all of these social problems at the same time, produce a dynamic, competitive economy that's competing with the so-called, dynamic capitalist economies of the West, if not defeating them totally, especially in the field of electrification of vehicles and something, a BYD, Build Your Dreams. It's a very powerful Chinese car company, really challenging Tesla and throwing Tesla for a loop. They're supposedly the cars company is going to be coming out with self-driving cars like this year in all of their models. I mean, there's way ahead of the competition. But it shows you again a socialist competitive industrial economy combined with eliminating the social ills that affect the society. What an achievement.
Yeah, and I think that's something I think we should, conclude our episode by talking about this topic of the relation between China and the rest of the world and how this affects us in America in terms of the anti-war movement.
Yeah,
Because
and I want to get into that, John, because specifically, if we have time, could you speak a little bit about this question of dictatorship, authoritarianism, and tyranny? Because this has been the great attack on communist societies, whether it be in the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China or any so-called communist state, which is something inherent in the system deprives people of liberty, of the right to criticize the government, of the right to a fair trial, of a right to vote in elections every 4 years, to just say what you want. In other words, not only the right to vote, but the First Amendment freedoms includes the right to what more important than others. What do they call it? Freedom of conscience. The freedom of conscience, the freedom to practice religion, the freedom to think your thoughts, the freedom to speak out, to criticize the government. Can you talk about that with regard to China, either in particular or communist states in general?
so I have a theory that the if we look at societies, the degree of authority on one hand and liberty on the other, let's say it's a spectrum between absolute authoritarian, absolute libertarian. We know that all states, of course, are based in authority. That's the definition of a state. The state has authority over the territory. I would argue that the whether the state is more on the side of libertarian or authoritarian depends on the level of development that that society has reached and the internal and external threats to that country's sovereignty. So that if you look at the West, the reason the West has these so-called democratic liberties and freedoms was not just because the West just gave people these freedoms on principle. Uh, Over centuries and centuries of struggle were these freedoms achieved for the working classes of the Western countries because these countries in the West have a higher level of development, advanced economics, more industrial progress, and are therefore secure that they're not going to be internally or externally attacked and overthrown. So they are able to give more democratic mechanisms and liberties to the populations. For example, anytime that there has been a war or a threat of attack, we see this happen. I'll give you one example: the Civil War in the United States, when the South attempted to overthrow the United States. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. He suspended,
That's right.
he threw people in jail if they criticized the Union. So when a state is being attacked, when it is under threat from internal threat or external threat, the state will kind of reinforce its own boundaries to protect itself. So how it's a long-winded answer, but how that is relevant to socialism in China is that China is under the threat of being overthrown both from within by the what Mao called the capitalist roaders. These are the elements of feudalism, the elements of capitalism and imperialism from within China who want to overthrow the socialist revolution and reimpose capitalist domination into China. So
In common parlance, they just call this the business community or
the business elite, that's right, the business
business
class, the
elite.
corporate elite that wants to
Okay.
overthrow the victory of the Chinese Revolution and impose capitalism. There's also the threat of Western imperialism, that China will be attacked and overthrown by the United States and its allies, the same way that the United States attacked Korea, attacked Vietnam, attacked countries in Latin America, attacked Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. So China does
And
not
Iran, and
be
Iran,
and Iran. China does
and
not want to
Chile.
be
Um,
sanctioned,
yeah.
overthrown, attacked, destroyed, destabilized by the West. So, because they're under these conditions of siege, um, the theorist Michael Parenti calls it siege socialism. Siege socialism, that this is not a utopia. This is socialism under the conditions of being under attack by the Western imperialist powers.
But do you see something endemic in the theory itself that just doesn't respect individual rights, individual liberties?
I think that it's absolutely not the case because the individual rights and liberties that we have, even in the West, I think they didn't come to us from the capitalist class. They came from the working class who fought, uh, for example, to expand the vote to all people, regardless of their race. It took the Revolutionary War, it took the Civil War, it took the Civil Rights Movement, it took the labor movement, it took the women's suffrage movement. Every time there has been an expansion of freedom to the common people of the United States, it didn't come from the
Right.
government, capitalists. It came from the ordinary working people fighting for their rights. So in
But
that
what,
sense,
but doesn't Marxist theory refer to these things, freedom of speech, freedom to criticize the government, freedom of religious practice, as what they call bourgeois rights? In other words, somehow they're not really real rights because they operate in a system of tyranny called capitalism, where really these rights end at the factory door. You walk into work and you no longer have a freedom of speech or freedom of thought, or you're a slave of the boss. You're a wage slave. You do what the boss, you live your life as the boss commands for 8 hours until you leave the work.
yeah,
But the
that's true.
but does the theory of Marxist thought does it somehow dismiss these rights as bourgeois, therefore not important, not something that a socialist society has to be concerned with?
No, I think it's actually the opposite. I think that socialism argues that the rights that we have under capitalism cannot be fully implemented because capitalism, like you said, if you have the right to freedom of speech or freedom of thought, the second you walk into your job, your boss controls what you say, what you do, etc. So we actually our rights are restricted by the capitalist economy. Whereas the argument is that socialism would actually make those rights expanded and real because you can't have real freedom and rights if you have millions of people homeless on the street, millions of people starving, millions of
Right.
people can't afford to live. So, in order to give people true rights and freedom, there has to also be economic prosperity and economic security and an end to sort of this economic oppression that
Right, because how can someone exercise their political rights to, say, participate in an election and listen to the candidates and attend a town hall to hear whether or not we should have park benches or not, or paint the bus stop a certain color? How can someone do that when they're living in a condition of what we call homelessness, where they're living on the street, they don't know where their next meal is going to come from, no less where they're going to sleep that night. They have no money. They're they're not sanitary. They might be mentally
right.
disabled now and affected. How can they possibly live as practice what they call the civic virtues? How
No,
can they do it?
and that's something I think FDR had that quote that one of his my favorite quotes that he said, where he said something about men who live in poverty are not free because if you're homeless and you're out of a job, that's a dictatorship. That is, you have no rights, you have no tyranny. I mean, you might have rights on paper, but you have no practical means of exercising those
But
rights.
you can't exercise the political rights, and therefore they are sort of illusory
Right,
because you don't. So the idea of citizenship, properly understood, is this kind of idea of a social citizenship, where yes, you do. You have political rights to think your thoughts and practice your religion, have freedom of conscience, but you also have but you also have social rights, the right to affordable home, to guaranteed health care, the right to a job, full employment economy
right.
if you require a job, these sorts of things, right to food and shelter. So you need both, and at the same time, this is what we've talked about in past episodes, but what are the responsibilities of citizenship? Those are the rights of citizenship. They go with responsibilities too, which is maybe perhaps every citizen should have a certain commitment to the country itself. Serve 2 years, not necessarily in the military, but serve 2 years of public service,
That's right.
cleaning the environment, or taking care of our wilderness, or taking care of the elderly, or
A great point
sorts
because
of
we
things.
have such an individualistic notion of our freedoms, our society in America, that we don't think of the common prosperity. So
Yeah, we don't really have a theory of citizenship. Trump talks about we don't want people in the United States who aren't citizens, but is anybody here a
this, right,
citizen?
right.
Does anyone really have
No,
obligation to
well,
the values of the country and also commit to the country to give a few years of service of their life for their country?
no,
We hear a lot of people thank you for your service.
yeah,
It's such a meaningless sort of liberal
absolutely.
expression.
I
So
think we could maybe we could wrap up the discussion with kind of just mentioning. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I think it's always good to bring this up.
yeah,
And
could you sum it up, John, in terms of
yeah,
also the
well,
anti-war, how this relates to creating a new politics that's
yeah.
progressive and anti-war?
Well, one of the really beautiful phrases that they use in China is they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that is meant to imply that the way that they practice socialism, they're not trying to impose their country's model onto other people or other nations. The term Chinese characteristics implies this is the model that they have arrived at based on their own history, their own circumstances, their own culture, their own civilization, based on where they are at. That does not mean that we sitting here in America, we have a different culture, a different history, a different economy, a different set of circumstances. So when we apply our socialist theory to America, we have to build socialism with American characteristics. That is, how do we put socialism in practice in our own country, given our history and culture? So a lot of people misunderstand that. Whenever I talk to liberals, they think, oh, China's this evil dictatorship, and you're saying you want socialism, so you just want to take China's model and just turn America into a horrible authoritarian dictatorship. Well, socialism isn't a one size fits all utopian model that you just impose onto everybody. It has to grow organically. And so that's one piece. And the last thing we could probably talk about is we have to push back against the demonization of China. Whether you agree with socialism, don't agree with it, like China, don't like China, The big problem is that we are having a push towards a new Cold War. We've talked in other episodes about the Cold War against Russia. The Cold War against China is being ramped up by our politicians and our media to make us fear China, hate China, and ultimately set the stage for a great war against China. And that's something we in the anti-war movement in the United States have to resist.
Yeah, we absolutely. That's so well said, John, and thank you for summing that up. That's I think the number one challenge facing the anti-war movement. We must push back on the idea of war on China. It's just insane. You're talking again about an eighth of the world's population, and just because they have a different system of government, they don't want big corporations running their economy. They don't want the big oil companies running their energy policy. They don't want the pharmaceutical corporations running their healthcare policy. They don't want Wall Street regulating their economy. I think most Americans would agree with this sort of an approach. And could this be implemented here in a way that's consistent with our own democratic values, so-called, sort of a constitutionalized socialism, a socialism that is constitutionally sort of established, that protects human rights, individual rights, and liberties, but at the same time prevents this terrible corruption of our entire economy and our entire government by corporate interests and the wealthy and powerful oligarchs that currently control our politics in both parties. In both parties. So that's the challenge, and I think you expressed it well that pushing back. No war on China, and just the opposite. We're going to need China if we're going to build a strong economy here, and that's what we need to promote.
That's right. We need cooperation, not war and competition. But thank you guys. Thank you all for listening. Will, it's a great discussion. I love talking to these topics with you. If you guys want to learn more, please tune into our podcast. We are posting videos twice a week. We're the Praxis Report. We are the podcast that analyzes theory and figures out how to put it into practice so that we can change the world for the better. And we will see you guys next time. I am your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
Co-host William Barth. Peace, y'all.